Well, first, let me say thank you so much to all of you for coming. Let me say thank you to Patrick as the president of the Media Institute. It's such a pleasure for me and my colleagues from Microsoft to be here today. We deeply appreciate that so many of you in the room have played such a vital role in creating the benefits of the country that we live and work in today. We're thrilled to have here today members of Congress, officials from the White House, officials who have played leadership roles at the state level, leaders from the nonprofit community, and so many others who have contributed to what we now have the opportunity together to build upon. This is an issue that is near and dear to our hearts at Microsoft: broadband connectivity for this nation. We're not a telecommunications company, and we don't want to be one. We're not a broadcaster, and we don't want to be one either. But we are a technology company, and we're a technology company that for 42 years has focused not only on building better products, but on creating bigger markets. In fact, you might say that Microsoft's role in the PC generation was just as much focused on creating a market for the ubiquitous and low-cost distribution of PCs as it was for the creation of the operating system itself. So, too, we have an opportunity to do something that we believe this country needs to get done, and that's to close the rural broadband gap. As we look to these opportunities for the future, it doesn't hurt to find inspiration from the past. Because a century ago, the mall didn't look like this photo behind me. It looked like this photo instead. The Lincoln Memorial was under construction. The entire mall was under construction. But interestingly, at the same time that those pillars were going into the Lincoln Memorial, there was in this very hotel, what was called then the new Willard Hotel, on March the 7th, 1916, an august gathering. A gathering that indeed was far more historic than our lunch, but I think a gathering from which we can draw inspiration. It was an evening gala event. It was the annual dinner of the National Geographic Society, which helped us find some of the information I'll share with you. They published in their March 1916 edition the story of that evening. It was a remarkable night here in Washington, D.C., because that night, 800 people gathered in this hotel, leaders from government and technology and the nonprofit community, to do something that people in the United States had never done before. They took a voice voyage across this country. During the evening, they looked at this map, and as each guest had a receiver for a telephone in front of them next to their place setting, they simultaneously were able to pick up those receivers and put them to their ear and hear people on the other end talk from large cities like Chicago and Denver and Seattle, but also small towns like Pocatello, Idaho, Walla Walla, Washington, Trinidad, New Mexico, and even from Ottawa, Canada. As they toured the country by voice, they were connected with El Paso. And there, in the local telephone building, they got to hear the voice of General John Pershing. This was just a year before he led the United States Army into World War I. And so the first thing that they asked him was, "How's everything on the border?" Well, apparently even a century ago, people were talking about the Mexican border. General Pershing happily responded, "All's quiet on the border." He was then asked another question. "Did you realize you were speaking to 800 people?" To which he replied, "No, I did not. If I had known that, I might have had something more interesting to say." But the point was made. And as they connected with other people and the voice voyage drew to its initial close, everyone in the room got to hear the voices of 2-, 3-, and 5-year-old boys, King and Lawrence Harris. They were in San Francisco, their parents were in the room, and everyone heard the kids say goodnight to their mother and father. Just when the crowd thought that they had seen everything that would be demonstrated that night, they discovered that there was more, something completely new and different, something that the country had never seen before. The marvel of modern day communications, not by wire, but by wireless transmission. The dinner guests were transmitted to the Arlington radio towers run by the Navy across the Potomac, which was then connected by wireless antennae all the way up to Manhattan. And they then heard a phonograph play the Star-Spangled Banner as a motion picture showed the waving flag on the end of the wall. The crowd was moved to its feet, literally. At that time, it still took 4 days to travel physically from New York to San Francisco. Modern telephony as we know it was still in its infancy, and yet all 800 of these guests had visited literally 21 places in 17 states and Canada in mere minutes. The Washington Post covered it prominently. It was literally a modern-day marvel, because until that evening, people thought of commercial telephone service as something that was confined to intercity lines between the biggest cities in the country or a few other small telephone exchanges. And as the leaders that came that evening, including Alexander Graham Bell, who had filed his first patent application 40 years before, stood together not just to look to the past, but to talk about the future. The man standing next to Alexander Graham Bell at the forefront of this photo is Theodore Vail. He was the president of AT&T. And more than anything, it was his vision to bring long-distance telephones to every rural connection in the country. At the time, a telephone looked like this. This is the 1916 telephone, or at least the same type of telephone that those two kids in San Francisco had used. And Vail challenged the crowd. He said, "Is it too much that in time it will be possible for anyone at any place to immediately communicate with anyone at any other place in the world?" Well, as we know, it became possible. Yet, interestingly and challengingly, we find ourselves in the same building 101 years later, with a new generation of challenges, as we live in a country today where 34 million people, more than 10% of our population, currently lack access to broadband. And critically, of this 34 million, 23.4 million people live in rural areas. They lack a broadband connection at a time when that connection has become a necessity of life. It is a critical connection to progress. We created a map using the data that the FCC published last year. This map shows the state of broadband coverage in each county in America. The dark green counties are not necessarily at 100%, but they are counties where 2/3 or more of the people have access to broadband. The middle colored counties are middle counties. They have coverage of 1/3 to 2/3, and the white counties on this map have coverage for less than 1/3 of the population. And yet, despite this glaring disparity, the truth is progress for broadband penetration around the country has plateaued. As the Wall Street Journal recently remarked, rural America is stranded in the dial-up era. Literally. Even close to Washington, D.C. If you drive across the Potomac and enter Virginia, of course so many people in the metropolitan D.C. area are familiar with the high broadband speeds in the counties in metropolitan D.C. But if people keep driving for just a little while, they'll find themselves in counties that are altogether different. Counties where only half the population, or less than a third of the people, benefit from the type of broadband access that we in this room, I'll bet, mostly take for granted. We take it for granted at a time when literally broadband services have become a necessity for life, for every part of life. This is not just about watching YouTube videos on tablets, as enjoyable as that might be. It's about education. It's about healthcare. It's about agriculture and growing a small business. It is a vital part of modern day life. It took 66 years to bring long-distance telephone to every corner of this country. And if there is one and even only one thing that we take away from lunch today, I hope it will be this. In our country today, 23 million people do not have the luxury of time. We should not force an entire generation of people to lose the chance for a world-leading education, to bring farming into the 21st century, or to grow jobs in small towns. If we take away nothing else, we should take away this. The time has come. We need a new approach as a nation to close this broadband gap. We didn't settle for less when it came to electrifying the country. We didn't say, let's leave 10% of the population behind. They'll get electricity someday. We didn't settle for less, even though it took long for the telephone. We should not settle for less today. Now, the good news, in part, in our view at Microsoft, is that we have a new technology that can help. It won't be a panacea, nothing ever is, but it can help change the game. It's called TV white spaces. You can certainly learn a lot more about it in the white paper that we've shared with each of you at your table, or by going online to the website that we've created. It uses vacant channels in the TV band, super spectrum, if you will, where signals travel a long distance. Some of us in this room probably grew up at a time when we actually had some experience with those antennae that we used to call rabbit ears. It would get a TV signal terrestrially by VHF or UHF, and what we realized was that these signals were strong if only you adjusted the antenna a bit. These are signals that would travel over long distances, around hills, through trees, and through the walls of our houses or buildings. It changed the game for television at a time when it was the only way for people to connect with television. Now it can continue not only to serve television, but literally serve the public and the country by putting it to public use as well as to broadcast use. It takes a number of things to come together to build a market and a future that I think we have the opportunity to contemplate here. Not surprisingly, the first building block it takes is technology. It has taken a lot of technology to come together to create the building blocks that can make this vision a reality. Let me share a little bit about how TV white spaces works. It starts with a broadband backhaul cable that connects to a base station and an antenna. And then that antenna transmits a signal. With the power of these antennae, one can typically reach 10 miles or so, and hence you can build an antenna and cover a 10-mile radius. And within that radius, the signals go out, and they can be heard by endpoint devices in a home, on a farm, in an office, in a school. All of it is made possible in a critical way by TV white spaces database technology. The database technology contributes to a solution that helps avoid interference with the spectrum that's being used by adjacent channels, and manages the channels that are available. So the endpoint devices can detect them and can connect and communicate with them. It is exciting to see how just in the last couple of years, the technology itself has advanced. What we're talking about is not obviously what we saw a century ago, but some technology that's altogether different. Something like this device that is easy for me to hold in my hand. It's made by a company called Adaptrum. Now, Adaptrum's CEO is here today. I had the opportunity first to meet him in Nairobi in September of 2011, when together we had the opportunity to turn on the first TV white spaces signal on the continent of Africa. A lot has happened in the 6 years since. This device can operate on the base station of a tower. It can operate as a client device in a home or in a school. It's already been certified by the FCC. We've been putting it to work here in the United States, in Virginia and Washington State, as well as in countries as diverse as Colombia, Jamaica, Kenya, and Malawi, just to mention a few. Now today, this device costs $800, but what is exciting is that by this time next year, one can expect to buy this device for $200, and there will be an even more powerful device from Adaptrum on the market. But there are other devices as well by other manufacturers. There's this device, which is from a company called 6 Harmonics. It's based in Ottawa, Canada. They've already certified 6 different white spaces devices with the FCC. This specific device will soon be submitted for FCC certification. Now, one of the exciting things about this device is that it can support what's called the bonding of signals over 3 different TV white spaces channels. And by doing that, both indoors and outdoors, it can manage a signal that has an operating speed of up to 40 megabits per second. That is faster than the FCC definition of 25 megabits per second. And if we really want to get a glimpse of where the future is, in fact, taking us, it's worth looking at these prototype devices from a company called Viacom. This is an important part of the future. This device can be put outdoors or indoors. It can then be connected with additional devices because this will pick up a broadband signal that comes in any which way, including by a TV white spaces connection, and then it will transmit information and data through either Wi-Fi or TV white spaces signals itself. This is a dongle that can fit into any laptop we might have. This dongle can be up to a kilometer away from this device, and one will have broadband speed. If you're like me, you take your laptop out onto your patio and you can't get your Wi-Fi signal. Imagine being able to take this and sit a kilometer away and still be connected to a broadband signal. But even more than that, this currently gets a 25 megabit per second signal using one channel. But with its approach to the potential bonding of signals over multiple channels, it will be able to manage speeds of up to 400 megabits per second. Imagine what that kind of throughput can mean for the future. Well, of course, I might imagine if you're looking at all this and it sounds so great, you might say, well, then why am I only hearing about this now? Why has it taken so long to even talk about TV white spaces becoming a reality? Well, in reality, I would say that's actually because it's the way technology works. If you look at the evolution of telecommunications technology, it took, for example, 13 years for the cell phone to go from the FCC's initial allocation of spectrum in 1970 to the first commercially available cell phone device in 1983. It was the Motorola Dynatec 8000. I suspect nobody has one today. In a similar way, history followed a similar path for Wi-Fi. That journey took 14 years. The FCC made unlicensed spectrum available for Wi-Fi use in 1985. 14 years later, in 1999, a technical standard was adopted, the Wi-Fi Alliance had been formed, and the public had an opportunity finally to make a Wi-Fi connection through a computer. Unfortunately for Microsoft's case, it came from Apple and it was an iBook, but it was quite a good device. The first TV white spaces rules were adopted by the FCC only in 2008, and they had to be reworked almost entirely for readoption in 2010 in order to be made viable. We're at the 9-year point, and we're at the point where we believe this technology is ready to take off. And we don't say that on the basis of theory, although we have had some of the best researchers at Microsoft Research theorizing and inventing technology in this space for 15 years. We base this on practical experience. We have been hard at work in 17 countries with 20 white spaces projects that today are connecting 185,000 people. That experience has given us the opportunity to learn from people literally around the world. At times in countries that were eager to leap because they saw this as an opportunity to leapfrog industrial nations. It's work that has taken us, it's work that at times has taken me to fascinating parts of the planet. To a town in Kenya called Nanyuki. This is about 100 miles north of Nairobi. It's exactly on the equator, and what is most interesting from today's perspective is this. Only 12% of the people who live there actually have access to electricity. How do you bring broadband connectivity to people who lack electricity? The truth is you innovate, you experiment, you find great partners like we did in a small startup named Mawingu, the Swahili word for cloud, and you put your energy behind them and you watch and learn from what they can do. That's what I've had the opportunity to do over the years, to meet the young people who frankly have built jobs that simply did not exist. This very smart young fellow that I'm standing with here in this photo was actually providing technical support over his laptop by email to customers in Europe who, believe me, had no idea that they were relying for help on someone who lived in a place that had no electricity. But if that's not enough to inspire one about what this can bring to the future, it's the smiles and the faces of the kids in schools that one has the opportunity to meet. Like this school, where we helped bring internet and broadband connectivity, and in 1 year, we saw the average test scores of these kids on the 5-point Kenya national exam go from 2.6 to 3.8. That is the kind of impact that technology can have. Now, as I mentioned, as a company, we're very focused on not just products, but markets. How do you build a market? Because that's what we're trying to do here. It takes more than products. It takes a lot of people coming together. It takes standards work, and that's what the industry has been doing for the past decade. That's what we can look at today and say the necessary standards are in place, thanks to important work in groups like the IEEE and the IETF. That is what makes it possible to start to bring these products to scale. It also takes a huge focus on innovative business models, the kind that it took to help a local company succeed, even on the basis in Kenya of selling a subscription for only $3 a month. Because believe me, that's all the local population could support. So we've taken what we've learned from that business model innovation, and then we are very excited by what is clearly the fourth building block, the demand curve for services. People in this country get it. Believe me, we hear from people every day. We've received emails from people across rural America this morning as they've read about this in the New York Times and other places. They know that this is a necessity for their life, and their question is very simple. It is, how fast can this get to me? Well, the good news is when you put these blocks together, the new technology, the standards, the business model innovation, and the demand curve, it is clear in our view that this is now ready to scale. That, more than anything else, is one of the reasons that it is the time for this country to set a new course, a new rural broadband strategy. Now, anybody who works in business will tell you that the first step in having a clear strategy is to have a clear goal. And we believe that there is an ambitious but achievable goal that this country can pursue. It is to close the rural broadband gap in 5 years, by July 4th, 2022, to ensure that all of these 23.4 million Americans that lack this connectivity today can benefit by then. TV white spaces will play a critical role, but it is not the only part of the answer. In recent months, we've worked with BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, on a directional analysis. And what BCG concluded in its analysis is that TV white spaces is the most cost-effective solution for about 80% of rural America, specifically people who live in areas that have a population density between 2 and 200 people. That's the right solution for them. But for people who live in an area where the population density is less than that, it shouldn't be TV white spaces, it should be satellite. And for people who live in rural areas where the population density is more than 200 per square mile, we should look to fix wireless 4G technologies and even some limited fiber to the home. What is most interesting, I think, what is most compelling about all of this new technology and this analysis is this. As BCG's directional analysis showed, this is a way to cut the cost substantially of what will be required to close the rural broadband gap. We're so used in the country to talking about the big numbers, for example, associated with bringing fiber to every home. Estimates that have been placed between $45 and $65 billion or even more. Even when you talk about connecting people through the kind of wireless technology that we take for granted in urban areas, you're still talking about costs of $15 to $40 billion. The cheapest approach is to deploy this mixture of technologies. Looking to TV white spaces for 80%, these other technologies for the last 20, we now have something that we believe can be done not for $50 billion or 25, but between $8 and $12 billion for the nation. We start to have a problem that is more affordable to solve. That doesn't mean it will be easy, but anytime you can come to Washington and turn a $50 billion problem into a $10 billion problem, I'll argue it's an unusual day in Washington. It's something to which we should pay attention. It will take more than recognizing that it's this mixture of technologies that's required. We need a strategy that brings the private and public sectors together, that creates a market and relies on incentives and opportunities for market investment and innovation, but looks to the public sector to do what the public sector needs to do to fill in the gap. Today, one of the things that we are doing at Microsoft is launching our own initiative, Microsoft's Rural Airband Initiative. It has 3 elements, and we believe that each is important. The first will be direct investments with telecommunications companies to reach 2 million people over 5 years. That is our goal in terms of what we believe we can do directly as a company. We'll build on the pilot projects we've been doing in the United States and around the world, and we will undertake work to put in place 12 projects in 12 states in 12 months. So we can get going and work with others to show the country what can be done. All of this relies on a particular model that we built in terms of how we're going to manage this. It is not our goal to make a profit from these projects. In fact, it is our goal to not make a profit. We're going to invest money. We're going to pay for the upfront capital costs with partners. We're going to turn to the partners to be the telecommunications companies that will then operate this network. And then we're going to seek a revenue share to recoup our capital costs. And for the next 5 years, we're going to take the money that we get back through that revenue share, and rather than turning it into profit, we are going to use it to expand coverage, to then work with more partners to bring connectivity to more places around the country. Now, let's also be honest. We appreciate that if we can bring 23 million more people into the broadband connectivity era in the United States, every tech company in the United States will benefit. because we'll all have the opportunity to serve these customers with more services. But when it comes to the direct operation, we will not be making money. That's the first of the three things that we'll be doing as part of our Airband initiative. There's a second piece that many of us are equally and in some ways even more excited about, because it's what we will do for people in the communities that get this new connectivity. In short, we will invest with others to bring more digital skills training to the communities that get this access. I'm very excited today to announce a new partnership, a multi-million-dollar, multi-year partnership with the National Council for the 4-H. Jennifer Sarangelo, their CEO, is here with us today. What we're going to do in partnership with the National Council for the 4-H is to unleash the dynamic energy of one of the strongest forces in America and in rural America, and that's the teenagers of America who are part of the 4-H program. We'll turn to them to provide training in digital skills, let them teach their peers, and then have them share what they learn with people of all ages. We're lucky because some of them are here today. From Mississippi and Arkansas and New York and New Jersey, stand up, meet the future. We're all going to put technology into your hands. Thank you. And we're going to rely on you and the other members of the 4-H to put it to work. You can sit down now. Or stand, whatever you want. We're also going to create new volunteer opportunities for our employees. As a company, we have one of the biggest annual giving campaigns for employees of any company on the planet. We generate over $100 million a year through that effort. And guess what? Many of our employees have come to work in places like Seattle and Boston and Silicon Valley from rural towns across this country. They remember where they grew up. We're going to create opportunities for them to give back to their communities, to get involved in volunteer time as mentors and connect the engineering workforce of Microsoft with people in rural America. That's our second piece, this philanthropic piece, all managed by Microsoft Philanthropies. But there's a third piece as well, and it in some ways is every bit as vital as the other two, because our ultimate goal is to be a catalyst. We want to be a catalyst for the marketplace so that more capital is spending not just to add capacity in urban areas where there is already broadband coverage, but more capital flowing to the areas where coverage doesn't yet exist. And to do that, we're going to take what we have, what we believe is probably the world's most valuable patent portfolio, 39 patents in the various technologies, 4 TV white spaces, and we will license it royalty-free, free of charge to all comers, all companies, even competitors who want to put this to work in this spectrum so we can move faster to connect the country. We're going to combine that with the sharing of source code that we've developed to help implement this technology, and we're going to get on the road. We're going to go share what we've learned and provide that technology know-how to others. We think if we do those three things, pursue direct investments, invest in communities with the National Council for the 4-H, and license and share technology, we can start to accelerate momentum. We can't solve the problem. Directly, we're only going to solve 10% of the problem. But what we hope to do as a company is be a catalyst so that we can all learn from each other to work on the rest. Now, as I said, the public sector has an important role to play as well. And specifically, there's 3 steps that we believe the public sector needs to take. The first is to establish the regulatory certainty that is needed to keep the spectrum available. Now, as I mentioned, this operates in the so-called TV band, the band that used to be used by television stations. And that band has been changing in terms of how the FCC manages its use. Some of this band has been auctioned off and licensed to mobile carriers. But we believe it's important to ensure that in every top market in the country, there are at least 3 usable channels by the public, by everyone in the public, for this TV white spaces technology. And in rural areas, there will probably be more. But this is what it will take to some degree to incentivize the hardware companies to really invest in mass production at low cost of the devices that will get to people's homes and farms and schools. Now, the good news is that a lot of work has already taken place on 2 of the 3 channels that are needed. One is the so-called duplex gap. That's 11 megahertz that's available here between the spectrum that's been auctioned off to the mobile carriers. And one doesn't even need all 11 megahertz. If one creates one channel there of 6 megahertz, as the FCC has done, that provides a first channel for everyone's use. The second is channel 37, work where there's been a tremendous amount of technical effort in collaboration with many to make sure that we can put this to work for TV white spaces and for hospitals who are focused on medical care. And then we need to find a third. The FCC needs, in our view, to allocate a third. There's the so-called vacant channels that are there today. There are 15 of them. They are important. They're important to the nation's broadcasters. They're important to the nation's low-powered TV broadcasters. But we think that of those 15, we need to find one that we can make available to the public in every top market across the country. If we do that, if we focus on how we can all work together to meet the needs of television broadcasters and mobile carriers, you know what we can do? We can create a spectrum below 800 megahertz in this country where 210 megahertz goes to broadcasters, 140 megahertz goes to licensed carriers, and 18, only 18, can go to the public of this nation for use in TV white spaces. It seems to us like the foundation for a path forward. A second step is needed by the public as well, and that's public funding at both the federal and the state levels. Already there are 11 states in the nation that are providing public funding for what are called broadband funds. We hope that the administration will consider making 21st century infrastructure like broadband part of an infrastructure bill this fall. And we hope that at the federal and state levels, public funding will be made available for all the technologies that can go to work. We think that government funding can have the biggest impact at the lowest cost if it includes an opportunity for targeted funding to match money for capital investments. That's what will accelerate this work. That's what can help reach parts of the country that the private sector might be slower to reach on its own. And with that kind of prioritization, the public sector can take a huge step in helping close this broadband gap. And then there's a final public step that is needed as well. The FCC has a huge opportunity, in our view, to accelerate its collection and publication of data about broadband coverage across the nation. The 2016 FCC progress report I showed earlier in the map actually was data from 2014. That's the most recent data that the public has available. But if we're all going to move faster in the public sector and the private sector, better and more current data will help. You put those 3 things together, regulatory certainty around spectrum, public funding, and public data, and we can bring that together with private initiatives. I want to leave you in these last few minutes with a little bit of a glimpse into what we've learned and why we care about this so much. Because whether we're talking about the heart of Africa or rural America, we've found that this makes a huge difference in people's lives. It makes a huge difference in small business. Today, we meet people who run small businesses who are struggling. They have to go to the library to access a broadband connection just to pay their bills. That is not a great way to grow a business. In fact, in Iowa, where they made real progress in expanding broadband coverage, a study found that they had added $20 billion in sales and 12% to the GDP of the state by better enabling small business to grow. It's not just small business that it's important for. It's important for agriculture as well. This has been a big area of focus for us over the last couple of years with our basic research scientists at Microsoft Research. They've been focusing on how to bring broadband connectivity through TV white spaces and connect it with sensors to unleash the future of agriculture through precision farming. They've been at work in the first pilot in Washington State, in a town called Carnation. It's interesting to take a moment to see what they've had the opportunity just to begin to learn more about.
This area is known as Stewart's Landing, and this is Dancing Crow Farm.
One of the world's problems is yield. How do you double the yield by 2050 to feed the growth of the population in the world? This is a project that we recently started. What we want to do is we want to enable data-driven farming. The first goal is to give a real-time view of the farm, the real-time pulse of the farm to the farmer, saying, hey, this is what your farm is doing right now. So how do you even connect these farms to the internet? It's so far remote, the cell carriers have very little incentive to provide connectivity in the farms.
The system that we have deployed here is measuring soil temperature and moisture, and it's coming from this sensor.
Here what you see is a white spaces device. The idea that we had was a farmer buys a white space router, plug it in the farm, and your entire farm is connected. Now you can connect multiple devices, and connectivity is cheap. So you can actually deploy many more sensors in the farm. You could have a dense deployment of sensors getting real-time view of all the parts of the farm. Not only your soil or moisture data, but this is a high bandwidth connection. You can connect cameras, get real-time views from the farm. So once you have all this data, you could then analyze the data to predict what the future would look like.
I'm actually really looking forward to how the process will change. This last year has been mainly a data gathering, information collecting year for the Microsoft research team. I'm really looking forward to seeing what research they've gathered this year, putting that together with what I think is going to happen next year, and make predictions for what I should plant when and where.
While we still have a lot to learn through our researchers and working with partnerships with major agriculture companies across the country and even around the world, it is clear to us that precision farming is the future of agriculture. It can help farmers increase their yields. It can help farms better manage their acreage in a sustainable way. But there are other aspects that are equally compelling. Take telemedicine, an area where there is more and more investment at the hospital level to providing services remotely. In Utah, where they've been a leader in deploying telemedicine through broadband connectivity, they've found that this has an appreciable impact in reducing overcrowding in hospitals. It is improving health outcomes. It is reducing health delivery costs. It's vital for many people, including the veterans of this country. So many people grew up in rural parts of our country and joined the military. And then when they were done, they went back, in many instances, to the rural towns in which they grew up. The Veterans Administration has recognized this. That's why it is investing in telemedicine. That's why the market for telemedicine is exploding. But of course, it works only if people have broadband connectivity in their home. Today, we meet veterans and we hear their stories of having to drive 4 or 5 hours to meet in person with a doctor when people in cities can do it from their living room. That is not a future that we should accept. And if there's one last area, one last scenario that I hope will inspire all of us in this room and around the country, it's this: it's education. We've had the opportunity to learn from the kids that we've had the chance to meet. Kids in places like Charlotte and Halifax counties in Southern Virginia, where we've had the opportunity to work in partnership with the Mid-Atlantic Broadband Communities Corporation to launch just these last several months a TV White Spaces project that by the end of this year will reach 1,000 homes and 3,000 kids. And if you're still a skeptic, if you still doubt that this is a technology that can improve people's lives, that can change their futures, take 2 minutes and watch this.
Just because you live in a rural area doesn't mean you shouldn't have the opportunity to be connected.
That was about, I'd say, 9th grade year is when I began taking college classes through dual enrollment. And that requires that you upload papers and assignments to the college as well as to the high school. The internet was terrible at home, so I would have to do my assignments really early, like a whole month early.
He had to submit a lot of his paperwork. It's just gonna sit there and just spin and spin and spin.
You know that the deadline's coming, and you know you need more research, and you know it's not enough. It's a struggle.
In the beginning of the semester, one of the questions I asked the students, just a show of hands, who has internet access? And typically, just a few. Right there, that tells me that I have to be a little limited in any kind of homework assignment I give. It's a handicap for teachers in the 21st century. I mean, here we are, hands are kind of tied.
The homework gap is a major problem for our region. And the exciting part is that Charlotte and Halifax County, our 2 pilot areas, are no longer going to be left behind in this digital divide. TV white space is a new technology that the FCC has allowed vendors to transmit broadband connections wirelessly over previously unused airwaves. Rural markets specifically, it is critical to have access to that lower band spectrum that allows internet providers to serve that last mile affordably. The goal is by fall to have about 250 connected, and we're hoping to have 1,000 families connected soon after that.
It's going to open the doors to economic development and allow the people in our area to have access to a world-class education.
It was a dramatic increase in productiveness and efficiency.
Dylan has a small antenna at his home, which is connected to a TV white space device, turns on his laptop, connects via Wi-Fi.
I don't know the tech side. All I know is it works.
Now that I have TV whitespace internet, I can use the cloud, and my grade actually shot up going forward with TV whitespace. I got high B's and A's.
This is where I grew up and I love it. I'm a country girl. Just train our kids so they can stay home and have that knowledge, and then they can bring it back here so that our community can grow.
TV whitespace held up very well with my college application. Once I graduate, I will be going to attend Old Dominion University in the fall, studying computer science. And I'm very excited to go.
We have some hard problems to solve, but we have the opportunity to join together. We can all work together to solve the problems that need to be solved. We should remind ourselves, we've done it before. It started in this very building. We can do it again. We can do it faster than before. Over the next 5 years, we can turn a map that looks like this into a map that looks like that. Thank you very much. So as you heard, I'd be happy to answer questions. Fire away, just introduce yourself, and I'll see what I can do. Sorry, Congressman Issa. I'll get a microphone to you.
Normally, this is Gary Shapiro's question. But these devices, if you have only one, work at X speed, one band. If you have two, they work from a physics standpoint dramatically faster.
Yeah.
3, you get to the kinds of speed that are true modern broadband. As you envision decades from now, this rollout occurs, Moore's Law occurs, you need much, much more bandwidth. Where is your vision of more of these devices working together, finding more bandwidth that can coexist within this or other spectrum, And is there really a limit to this if the FCC is innovative in how it allocates new devices?
Well, it's a great question, and I think there is an opportunity for the FCC to be innovative, and you've been a champion in calling for that innovation. To me, what's exciting is you're not necessarily going to need more devices, because devices themselves are going to be able to bond spectrum across multiple channels. But you do get dramatically higher speeds with the ability to bond more channels. So that's why our sense is with, say, 3 channels, now you're in the hundreds of megabits per second instead of the dozens. So in a world in the future, if there's even more enormous need for data, you can have devices that are very inexpensive that can grow in accordance with available spectrum. I think the future, in part, is a shared future. And this is where I do believe that the tech sector and the wireless carriers, and especially the nation's broadcasters, need to come together. We need to spend more time talking with each other. You look at that spectrum today that is being used by broadcasters for terrestrial television. That is important. That's a valuable national asset. But of course, over time, broadcasters may find that they want to use TV white spaces, that they're going to meet their customers and their users much more seamlessly. They'll have a much bigger audience if they're taking advantage of this spectrum as well. So I do think that over time, we all have the opportunity to learn from each other. And I appreciate that Washington, D.C. is sometimes a place that maybe specializes in more heat than light. But I'll tell you, across the country, you go to a small town, they get it. They know that this is their future. And I really think it calls on all of us who represent people, who work in the nation's capital, or who visit like I do, to find creative ways to serve each other's needs in a collaborative and creative manner. I think if we do that, then we can find ways to ensure that the spectrum serves the public, including broadcasters and everyone else.
Hi, I'm Steve Postios. I'm with the American Consumer Institute. I think this sounds like a really great opportunity, particularly in rural areas because of a lot of unused channels. My question is, what infrastructure do you see will be required, and how will it be paid for?
Well, great questions. I mean, part of the infrastructure is really at the capital level, obviously, and you might think about it as having 3 pieces. There's the backhaul fiber that does need to get laid to a base station. There is then the construction of that antenna with that base station. And then obviously, as is always the case with information technology, the biggest part of the infrastructure really is what are potentially millions and millions of endpoint devices. Now, none of us knows entirely at this stage, down to the last dollar, how much of this can be paid for with the market alone. But we believe that a very substantial, I'll say majority of it, can be unleashed through market incentives. The key is to provide the incentives for companies to invest in the backhaul fiber and the antenna and then operate the service. And then what you really do by getting to mass production is lower and lower costs for, frankly, smaller and smaller endpoint devices. We think that the endpoint devices with mass production can get down to a scale that, say, by 5 years from now, consumers may not even need to pay for it themselves. It'll just be provided by the telecommunications operator as part of the service. So what we would hope is that this can principally become an initiative that the market pursues, and then public funding can increasingly identify the gaps. If we can get money that will accelerate the capital spending, then and good data, then we'll start to get a much better sense of where the gaps are that need to be filled. I may not be able to see everybody, so there's somebody waving over there. Sorry.
Hi, thank you. Peter Flynn from Viasat. Thank you for your presentation. It was absolutely fantastic and it's very encouraging and positive. My one question to you is, could you comment more about why TV white space? I think a lot of people don't understand why this particular band is important. So much of the discussion in the FCC is about the mid bands, 3.5 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz, which is driving for densification and smaller footprints, as opposed to your initiative, which is trying to go broader. Can you please expand on that?
I would be happy to. Great question. It's a really interesting point because we're all reading about things like 5G. And so you might think, well, if 5G is the most exciting technology in the future, why are we not jumping up and down about 5G for rural communities? And it all relates to the physics and the properties of signals at different levels of the spectrum. At the higher level spectrum, you have coverage that works very well in adding capacity in dense areas. But those signals don't travel a long distance. So they don't make sense for rural areas. The thing that is so exciting about TV white spaces is because the signals can travel a long distance. And I think this may be about the only technology issue where those of us, I'll say, over 40 have an advantage over people under 40. Because if you're over 40 years old, you might have actually used those rabbit ears. And for the rest of you who are, frankly, such a big part of our industry's future, you're looking at that and going, I don't get it. What were those things for? But it all took advantage of the physical properties of this spectrum. The fact that very high-powered antenna could actually transmit VHF or UHF signals, not 10 miles, but in some cases, dozens or even 100 miles. Now, with the operating power of these antennae and what we believe are needed, 10 miles is sufficient. But it all relates to the important physics. And of course, if I've learned one thing in politics and policy and law, politics can trump a lot of things, but not the laws of physics. The laws of physics govern us all, and that's what we're trying to bring together here in part. I think there was a question over here.
Gary Arlen from Arlen Communications. How, on a policy situation, how are you going to counter the comments like from NAB this morning, which said it's well documented, unmitigated failure that you've done in white space so far, and what will you do to counter the inevitable political fight that's going to come out in the next few years?
Well, I guess I'd call on us to do a few things. First, before we all spend time fighting with each other over 6 megahertz, one channel, because that's what the so-called debate with the NAB is about, 6 megahertz. Let's reflect on one fundamental fact. As we come here for lunch today in this very nice room, there are 23.4 million Americans that cannot do what each of us may be doing right now, and that is accessing a broadband connection even through a wireless device. So if we do nothing else, let's resolve that this is a problem that needs to be solved and that we will work together to solve it. And I would absolutely invite the NAB and somebody like Gordon Smith, who I had the privilege to work with when he was a senator from our neighboring state, not to just go hurl insults at each other, but let's sit down and find some way to solve some practical problems. That's what the nation should call on us to do. Now, has it taken time to get the technology so that it can scale? Yes, as it did with the cell phone, as it did with Wi-Fi, as it did with the personal computer. Anybody who's from the technology business knows that you don't create a PowerPoint slide showing the future and then have a market with products the next week. Our engineers tell us all the time when the senior folks create PowerPoint slides with a vision of the future. It has taken years, but no longer than it has for other technologies. And let's keep in mind one other thing. Look, when we look at that spectrum, and we take stock of the fact that 140 megahertz has already been auctioned off, has been licensed to wireless carriers who are paying for it and effectively exercising control almost akin to ownership. At a time when there's 200 megahertz that have been allocated to broadcasters who are not paying anything, nor should they, so they can make use of it. This is a call for 18 megahertz to be owned by the public, to serve the public, not to be purchased and owned by any single company. This is not something that I believe any company should buy. It should serve the public for generations to come, and the first thing we should do is ensure that we're able to put it to use to bring 23 million of our citizens into the same kind of benefits that so many of us in this room and other cities take for granted. I think we have time for one last question, if there is one. Sorry, go ahead.
Hi, Nicole Turner-Lee from the Brookings Institution. Fabulous presentation, and actually an area of interest to myself over the years, particularly when we start to look at white spaces in urban areas. So it's very ingenious to think about its application of rural. The question I have is just sort of to get some clarification. Do we see this as a technology that will grow the demand of new services? You know, obviously email from the student in the video is one purpose, but people are streaming video. You know, even if you go into the public benefit aspects of it, they're communicating with doctors in real time. Some remote monitoring and healthcare procedures are being done. Will white spaces accommodate that, or do you see the spread more as if we get it in there, we'll actually increase the return on investment and maybe drive the other players to come into the marketplace?
Well, I actually think we have the opportunity to do both of those things.
Yeah, I'd love to hear.
And it's a great point. I mean, the first thing that I hope we can do, our goal as a company, is to bring down the capital costs and in so doing, increase the return on investment for other companies in the telecommunications and technology business. Now, one of the things that I know many of you are familiar with, but many Americans in cities are not, is that the rural communities in this country are still, in many instances, served by very small telephone companies. They might be companies that have been owned by a family for multiple generations. And they're not able to put to work large amounts of capital. They certainly can't take big risks. So if we can develop a model that brings down the capital costs, unleashes investment by other larger companies, gets public funding for matching capital expenditures where it's needed, we start to unleash that kind of investment. But I also think that the other part of the equation, that's the supply side. The demand side that you're referring to is also vital. This absolutely should generate more demand for more telemedicine services, services that we believe will reduce the cost of providing health care in the country. It should provide more demand for the kinds of education activities that are harder to take advantage of when one lacks a broadband connection. It will unleash new services for small businesses, and I think perhaps more than in any area of the economy, for agriculture. I mean, you look at those sensors and you go, well, wow, that's so interesting. I never thought about a farm having those. A decade from now, there will be farms around the world that have better yields and more productive and profitable farmers because of those devices. And we want to ensure that the US agricultural community has the opportunity to benefit from that. So with that, let me close where I started. Thank you. Thank you to the Media Institute. Thank you to all of you.
Hey, we are adjourned. Good to see you, Congressman. Good luck.
Thanks.
You can make a splash thing out.